Welcome to Analytics-Driven Supply Chain Design, Key Challenges and Opportunities. This is a special webcast brought to you by our friends at Ames, Avetta, Coupa, Pivottree, and Sifted. My name is Bob Treblecock. I'm an editor at Peerless Media, and I'll be your moderator for this event. Joining me today is Dr. Milena Janjevic. Milena is a research scientist at the Megacity Logistics Lab at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Now, in addition to her research at MIT, Milena has written about supply chain design in Supply Chain Management Review. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you haven't done so already, I'd like to remind you that attendees are invited to download today's presentation. Just click on the resource icon on your screen, and we're going to add a PDF to that article by Milena in the resource icon. Finally, remember that this is an interactive event. Feel free to submit questions as you listen to the webcast. If we don't get to all of your questions, we'll forward them to Milena later. Now to today's webcast. This is the second time we've invited Milena to present her research on supply chain design. The first was back in 2020. Now, that webinar focused on the need to modernize design processes that were, for the most part, developed in the 1990s when the goal was to minimize the cost of warehousing and transportation. As we all know, a lot has changed since then, and well, since 2020. Today, Milena is going to bring us up to date on the research she and her colleagues are conducting at MIT, including how global trends and market developments are impacting the way we envision supply chain design, how to leverage advances in data analytics, machine learning, optimization, simulation, and network science to design flexible and adaptive supply chains, and finally, how to identify key opportunities to leverage the latest supply chain design methods and practices to gain a competitive edge. There's a lot on the plate. So, Milena, let's get started. The microphone is all yours.
Hello, thank you so much, Bob, for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here and present the latest results of our research. So, as you have mentioned, everything kind of started in 2020 when we published this article in Supply Chain Management Review. And that was actually a fruit of collaboration between me and a few of my colleagues at CTL. And so what we saw then was that basically companies were facing new challenges in supply chain design, but that the models and the decision support tools that we are using to make decisions in supply chain design did not actually catch up with the new industry trends. And we formulated a few of these trends, and we actually used this acronym VUCA that relates to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And so we said, okay, well, the environment in which we are operating is much more volatile. We have the lead times that are subject to a great source of volatility, oil prices, currency fluctuations, et cetera, et cetera. There's more and more uncertainty on the demand side, on the supply side. The networks that we are designing are more and more complex, and that's both on the global level, where we have a rising number of parties that are interconnected with trends towards multi-sourcing, et cetera, but also on the last mile part, where we have various channels in which companies are trying to reach their customers. And then when we make decisions in that space, we have various sources of ambiguity. So how do I balance between sustainability and cost? How do I balance between service levels and the need to keep my logistics operations efficient? And so basically the main idea here was that in this new environment, the supply chain design has to have a much broader scope of objectives. And so we really need to balance between the efficiency, resilience, sustainability, customer centricity, and the vast majority of the models, as you have mentioned in the intro, were developed in a time where the most of the focus was on cost minimization and on basically the physical configuration of our network. And so that was the first time we actually published on this need to rethink the supply chain design process. We did that in February 2020, so it was really just before the height of the pandemic. And after that, a lot of the things that we have mentioned actually came into practice, and we saw over the next 3 years that there are new requirements that are basically emerging to address these new challenges. And so what I will present to you today is an excerpt of the white paper that we recently published, and that basically provides an overview of the key challenges and key opportunities that we see in the area of supply chain design. Now, this is a much more thorough a white paper. You can download it here on the website supplychaindesign.mit.edu. And we really try to present kind of the state of the art, the state of the current tools, and then really formulate some of the key strategies for companies to really take advantage of the new supply chain design methods and approaches. We've co-published this with Coupa, and so the idea is really to combine our knowledge and experience of working with companies, of being in academia, with their experience on the ground. And so I would highly recommend to your viewers to download it and give us feedback if there are any other additional opportunities that they see relevant. So I won't have time to go through everything we've presented there, but to give you kind of a snapshot of some of the things we say there, we basically formulate two different types of opportunities. So the first opportunity, I kind of named it in one bucket that I call data and analytics, and that's really about how do we improve the models, how do we improve the analytical approaches, how do we improve the decision-making tools. And there we have formulated different ways of extending the current tools to basically better address current supply chain design issues. And here today I will focus on 3 of those in particular. Now, the other bucket, the other group of opportunities that we have identified in the paper is around the decision-making processes on supply chain design. And that's basically how do we use the tools and the different models to drive better decisions in organizations. And again, there I will come to a few of the ones that we have identified in the white paper together with Coupa. So yeah, let's just jump right into that. So in terms of data and analytics, there are actually 3 things that I want to focus on today, and that are in line with, I would say, the biggest opportunities that we've seen in the last few years. So for me, the key opportunity when we talk about data analytics is really extending the scope of supply chain design. And I will explain that right here. So let's look what comes up when I type supply chain design on Google, and what are some of the first research results that we get there. So we have here one definition that says it's a balance between inventory, transportation, and manufacturing cost. Another one that says, well, it's all focusing on the cost and time to bring goods and services to markets. And then we have something here about inventory, working capital, transportation costs, and transparency. So really, even the way that we define supply chain design is often very much linked to that idea of cost minimization. And actually, when we look at the result of that in the models and decision supporting tools, we will typically see that these are very well suited for modeling some elements of supply chain design. So for example, the trade-offs between the number of facility and facility cost or inventory, etc., but not so well for others. So let me just give you 2 examples here to basically illustrate that point. So the first example here is, let's say we are looking to determine the number of facilities that we need to deploy in order to service a given market. And so if I have my cost perspective, what I will do, I will basically have some relationship between my number of facilities and the facility of the cost. I will have another relationship between the number of facilities and transportation costs. And I will have a third relationship maybe between my inventory and my number of facilities. And I'll combine all of these things together into a single optimization model, and I will basically end up with a conclusion that I need to deploy 4 or 5 or 10 facilities to minimize my overall costs. And that's pretty much the approach that has been applied over the years, and that's been kind of the traditional de facto approach that has been used. Now, what we see is that if I only have my cost perspective, I'm actually going to end up with a design that is not very well suited for my other corporate objectives. And so let's look now at an additional element here, which is I'm not only looking at my total logistics costs in relationship to the number of facilities, but I'm also going to look at the demand that can be captured by the network of those facilities. And so the image is going to look something like this. I will have a network of facilities, and then for those areas that are located pretty close to those facilities, I will probably be able to capture a larger amount of market share. And then as I'm going further, my lead time, my reliability are decreasing, and my market share is also decreasing. And so with that in mind, if I only look at my basically cost optimal number of facilities, I'm probably going to go and miss another point, which is that there is this direct relationship between the market share and the number of facilities. And so that is one example of what we mean by extending the scope. If the decision support tools and models you are using are basically designed in order to minimize just a subset of your corporate objectives, which is, for example, just your supply chain costs, you will really not use the supply chain design as a potential driver of value and as a potential driver of your competitive advantage. And so that's why we emitted this idea of value-driven supply chain design, where we're actually looking at a way of balancing between my logistics costs, but also the potential of my supply chain design to capture revenue, to capture market share, increase customer service, et cetera, et cetera. Another example that I can give you to illustrate what we mean by extending the scope is related to this dilemma, this decision that we need to make between global or local sourcing. So that's definitely been something that companies have been thinking about a lot lately. And again, if you look at the press, there is somewhat conflicting evidence of what's happening. So this is from the Wall Street Journal, and the article says that companies are on pace to bringing home record number of overseas jobs. But then we also have another piece of evidence from a survey where actually the majority of companies say that either they have made no decision or they actually are not planning to do anything. And so the question is, okay, should we actually pursue with nearshoring? Should we change things with in view of what the pandemic has told us, and how do we actually quantify the effects of these decisions? And so there, again, if I look at a very limited way of considering my supply chain objectives, which is only looking at my costs, well, I will probably privilege some types of designs that are typically going to be using offshore production, and then, ocean transportation for sea freight, et cetera, et cetera. This is a framework that I thought is quite useful, and that actually compares the total cost or the total benefits of the global and local sourcing. And so what that framework does is it breaks down the different sources of cost into 3 different categories: static, dynamic, and hidden cost components. And we see that our static cost components are basically incorporating kind of the usual suspects, the things that we would expect to see in typical network design models. So it's going to be the purchase cost, the insurance, customs, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And if we only use that definition of cost of our supply chain, well, of course, our international sourcing is going to be probably the more beneficial one. Now, if I'm looking at the different additional cost components, such as, for example, these dynamic cost components, the picture can change very significantly. So a lot of the companies, for example, are realizing that the very long lead times that they have because of their global operations are actually leading to much larger degree of uncertainty, and that reflects on stockouts, that reflects on lost sales, that can reflect on larger levels of inventory, costs associated to expedite shipments. And then there's also going to be a number of additional components, which are what we call hidden cost components, and are linked to the changes that can occur with currency fluctuations, et cetera, et cetera. And so with all that in mind, you really need a framework where you're going to be able to compare very comprehensively all of these different elements of global and local sourcing. But we realize that most companies today don't actually have the proper analytical tools to do that. So a lot of companies are still struggling to basically quantify what one additional day of lead time will represent in terms of lost sales or inventory or stockouts. And so there's really a need to basically have a much more expansive considerations, and that's what we mean by expanding the scope to be able to make the proper decision in this space. The second key opportunity that we have identified together with Coupa was the requirement of incorporating the tactical decisions and operational decisions into supply chain design. Now, the typical decision-making process in supply chain planning is going to look something like this. We will have 3 levels of decisions, and we will have a sequential process between these levels of decisions. So typically, we'll first make our strategic decisions on supply chain design, process design, etc. Then we will have a given design that we will instruct to the tactical and operational level, and then they will make other lower level decisions on a more frequent basis, such as transportation planning, routing, inventory planning, carrier management, etc., etc. Now, this is the typical process, and the reason why we have the sequential order between these 3 levels is that, well, simply the frequency at which you're making these strategic decisions is actually not the same as the ones that you're making on the tactical and operational level. However, what we realize is that if you make your strategic decisions without actually anticipating what the use of those decisions is going to be at the tactical and planning level, you end up with very high deviation between the performance that you expect from your network and the performance that is actually realized by your network. And so you will design a network of facilities with given transportation costs in mind, but then actually in reality, when you start doing your tactical and operational planning, you will realize that there is a big difference between your planned and realized performance. And so what we suggest here is to basically bring back to the strategic level some anticipation of these user level decisions. And I will give an example to illustrate that shortly. And as I mentioned, the key reason for that is that this sequential process really does not capture the potential interrelationships that can exist between these decisions and can really lead to big differences in the expected and realized performance. And so one example here is in the realm of last mile distribution network design. And so this is actually a study that we did a couple of years ago. And you can see here, the study was done in Sao Paulo. You can see a network of different facilities that are free level. So we have distribution centers, satellite facilities, and then we have these very local transshipment points. And then on the right-hand side, you can actually see the service zones of those facilities and the transportation modes that have been deployed. And so what you can see here is that we have two types of minivans that can be insourced or outsourced. We can have cargo bike operations. We can have crowd shipping operations for some areas. But you can also see that there is a very clear correspondence between where I deployed my facilities and the type of transportation modes that I am using to service the demand from those facilities. So now, if I were to make my decision of facility configuration without taking into account the type of transportation modes and the routing of those vehicles that can be deployed, my picture would have been completely different, and I would have ended up with a network with a much smaller number of facilities that were located in much more peripheral areas. And so ignoring these tactical and operational level really makes your strategic decisions not robust enough to the everyday operations. Now, the third opportunity, and I think this is the one that has been on everyone's mind since a few years ago, it's the idea of accounting for risk and planning for resilience. So when we talked a few years ago, we had a similar webinar, and we were already talking about this requirement to basically account for uncertainty, account for risk in supply chain design. And we basically contrasted two different ways of accounting for risk. And so I'll reiterate on that, and then I'll tell you what are some of the new findings that we have been able to highlight in the last few years. So the traditional decision-making approach in supply chain design obviously is always facing some level of uncertainty. And so we have some uncertain parameter. For example, I have my demand, and I have various probability of different demand levels. So, I'll have probably an average level of demand that will have a pretty high probability, and then I have maybe some low demand or high demand scenarios that have lower levels of probability. And so that's basically the decision that we are making. We know that we cannot predict fully what our demand is going to look like, but this is essentially a probabilistic way of considering the demand. Now, what happens in our traditional decision-making approach is going to be something like this. Rather than saying I am actually accounting for the fact that my demand can have different realizations, I'm just going to bring everything back up to a certain average level. So I'll say, well, okay, on average, I plan on selling 100 units next year or something like that. And we basically construct a baseline scenario that represents that average baseline state. Then we basically build our network, and our network is going to give us the optimal configuration of facilities, the optimal service zones, et cetera, and it's going to be highly optimized for this one baseline scenario. So we are really going to be looking at the most effective way of servicing this one baseline scenario. However, when I then run a sort of a sensitivity analysis on what my network will behave in the other scenarios that are not the baseline scenarios, there I can actually end up with, again, pretty big deviations between what I expected my performance to be and what is my performance in my realized scenario. And so what companies typically do in that sense, they optimize for the baseline, they run the sensitivity analysis, and then they say, okay, well, if my demand increases, I need to plan for outsourcing. If it decreases, I can reduce my throughput or something like that. But basically, all of these flexibility measures are considered after the fact and not integrated into our essentially network design. Now, the problem with that is that this doesn't really capture the fact that we do not know in the beginning what our demand is going to look like, and it doesn't capture the range of these possible future scenarios. And so we can have really big deviations between my final demand that is maybe going to be different from my baseline and the performance that I was expecting from my network. And so what we have recommended already a few years ago was a different approach where rather than looking at this baseline demand and baseline scenario, I'm actually going to be building a number of probable scenarios, and each of those will have a value and a probability that is going to be associated to them. And so I'll have one scenario that is corresponding to a certain level of demand, another scenario, and then as many scenarios as I'd like. And then rather than looking at what network is optimal for a baseline on an average scenario, I'm actually going to build a model that is going to be optimizing for the expected value across of all of those different scenarios. So I'm explicitly taking into account the fact that I might have different futures with different probabilities and different values. And in addition to that, I will incorporate my flexibilities into the network design model. This approach basically guarantees our higher overall performance and lower deviations between the different scenarios. And so overall, if we have this stochastic approach where I'm not only optimizing for one potential realization of demand, but multiple realizations of them, I will have a overall better expected value. And so this is already something that we've talked about a few years ago. Now, what we've noticed since was that this expected value approach is actually very well suited for some types of risks, for some type of uncertainties, but is not very well suited for others. And let me give you an example there. So we can basically look at a given organization, at a given company, and we can do what we call mapping the risk exposure. And so I will look basically at all of the different sources of disruptions of risk, and I will map them according to two elements. One of them is how probable is that disruption, that risk will happen? And then the second one is what is expected impact? And so what happens there is that, an earthquake in California probably has a pretty high probability, but we can make sure the impact is limited. I can say that if I have a strike at a given supplier, again, low probability, low impact, et cetera, et cetera. But then I will end up with some of these events, some of these risks, such as global pandemic or major war in a given region, that have maybe a very low probability, but that really have a catastrophic impact on our operations. And so if I just use this expected value approach that I've described previously, what will happen is that because these events have such low probabilities, they will actually not be accounted for in my decision on my optimal network design. And that's something that we've seen for a lot of companies. A lot of companies did not have networks that were built to sustain these types of very improbable but very high impact risks. And Now, in order to incorporate this additional idea that I have to consider not only my most probable risks, but also other types of risks that are maybe less probable but have high impact, what I should do in my design selection phase is actually think about a much broader set of scenarios and basically map my designs not only according to what is the expected value, but also what is the risk associated with these different scenarios. And typically we'll end up with something like this, the higher the expected value, the higher the risk. And, we can measure the risk as, for example, the lowest level of performance or standard deviation or anything like that. And there now the question becomes basically, well, between my two different designs with different levels of risk and different levels of expected value, which one is more in line with the company policy and the risk aversion basically of the decision makers. And so it's not something we can purely capture by a quantitative model. And then I recently listened to a presentation of one of my coworkers, and he said something that I really liked. He said, humans are really bad in predicting, but are very good in preparing. And that's what this approach basically suggests you do. So if I have a very wide range of scenarios from the most risky to the least risky one, I can actually preemptively think about how I can incorporate my resilience into my network through redundancy, through flexibility. And I don't necessarily need to predict which ones of the scenarios will happen, but I can still prepare my supply chain to basically react to those different areas of risk. If I know that I'm in an earthquake-prone region, I don't necessarily need to know when that earthquake is going to occur, but I need to account for the fact that I have a plan B in case that things happen. So yeah, that's sort of a new finding, and I think a lot of companies are still trying to find a way to basically address these high impact and low probability risks. And there's really some exciting research happening around how we can actually integrate that into the decision making. So that's all on the data and analytics side that I'm going to be showing to you today. Now, here are the free opportunities. Here are some sample research topics on which we are actually working on. So we've been able to really formulate a number of things that need to be done to make these tools and make these models better aligned with the challenges that companies are meeting today. However, the kind of main premise of the work that we do at MIT is that the analytics and the models are only going to be useful if they can drive better decisions in organizations. And in a lot of the cases, we really see a disconnect between the decisions and the recommendations given by the models. And so that's why we really focused a second part of this white paper on what are the decision-making processes, what are the tools that are being used, how are they being used, and how we can make the process and the tools better to basically drive better decisions in the organization. And we formulated a bunch of different recommendations. Here I'll focus on 3 of these. Interactive analytics, collaborative supply chain design, and continuous supply chain design. Now, first point on interactive visual analytics. So here on the left-hand side, you can see a picture that was taken in the Computational and Visual Education Lab. And the whole idea behind that lab is that we are building visual interfaces in order to allow decision makers to interact with the models that we to be a certain resistance, and we basically build these interactive interfaces in order to allow them to essentially build intuition around what are the mechanics of those models and how they are behaving and why the recommendations are what they are. The interactive part of that is what we call human-in-the-loop analytics. And that basically concerns all of the interactions that can happen between the decision maker and the model. So I've previously talked about the fact that, if you place a facility somewhere, you'll be able to capture more demand near, and that the market share is going to decrease as you go further. Well, here you see one example where we have this visual interface and we actually allow the decision makers to play around with different demand functions and to basically adjust what that demand curve would look like. So what would be the demand captured according to how far I am from the facility. And that's very useful, especially when we are facing uncertain parameters, such as a company entering a new market, for example. The second kind of pillar of the better organizational processes is what we call collaborative supply chain design. Now, if you recognize that your supply chain design is not only there to service your predictable demand, but is actually an essential part of your corporate strategy, that means that you need to incorporate additional functions into the supply chain design process. So that should be sales, finance, marketing, whoever can make decisions relevant to the network that you're configuring. In other cases, that can actually even transcend the organizational boundaries. So, on a project that I'm currently working with one pharmaceutical company, we're actually looking at producing design models that are not only going to be optimizing the strategy from the company perspective, but also account for all of the different stakeholders in the pharmaceutical space. So that can be patients, authorities, insurances, healthcare providers. And so how do I find a design that basically captures the interests and the objectives of all of those different stakeholders and brings them together to work on a collaborative co-design process. And then the final recommendation that I'll give here around the supply chain design process is this idea of continuous supply chain design. So traditionally, because supply chain design is a strategic decision, we would see that companies would perform their design or their redesign maybe every few years. And the redesign is typically driven or triggered by a certain event. And that can be, a change in the corporate strategy, or it can be a new competitor, or it can be a new technology or something like that. But we have this basically event-based redesign studies, and then we kind of put that design aside, and then we wait for 5 years, and then we redesign again. What we noticed is that since the environment in which we are changing evolves, in which we're operating evolves so rapidly, this event-based redesign is not proactive enough, and we're always going to be basically lagging according to the latest market developments. And so what we are suggesting is to move from this event-based redesign approach towards continuous supply chain design approach, where you basically have a continuous monitoring and updating of your designs. And that basically gives you the possibility of being much more adaptive to the latest changes in your environment, but it also gives you a unique opportunity to basically learn as an organization on what is happening and improve the models, improve the processes around supply chain design as you go. And to illustrate this, this is just one engagement that we had with a major shipping company. And so, we started working with them. We said, okay, let's focus on what's important. We did a strategic design model, focused on cost. Then they realized actually an inventory is going to be an important component. Then they realized that actually they needed to incorporate more of a tactical element. But it's really an iterative process where every time we produce a model, we implement a model, we learn, and then we formulate new requirements as we go on. So that's for the key opportunities that we have identified in this white paper. Now, to give you a concrete example of how this can translate into a specific company engagement project, here are the results of one research project that we worked on with a company that was basically looking at designing their channel strategy in a new market. And so what they were considering was 3 different scenarios. So the traditional way of supplying their customers, a direct way where they would basically bypass a number of stock keeping points in the network, and then a home delivery option where they would just deliver everything to customers' homes. And so, we built a simulation model that allowed to basically assess these different scenarios, and they formulated 4 different objectives that they wanted to account for in their decision. And those were cost, lead time, inventory, and service level. And what that actually gave us as an outcome is something like this. So you see here that each scenario has been evaluated, has been modeled according to those 4 objectives. And there's really not a clear winner. My traditional way is the best in terms of cost. My home delivery is the best in terms of service level. And so the question is, well, how do I actually decide now which should be the preferred option? And so to help them with that decision, what we did is we incorporated this interactive way of defining the criteria in the application that we have developed for them. And so they were basically able to adjust the weights of the different criteria that will reflect the importance of one scenario or, one criteria or a different criteria. And so this is where this kind of interactive part comes into the play. And as an outcome, what we saw was this. They explored a very wide range of options, putting all the importance on cost or putting all the importance on service level and then everything in between. But what we saw is that actually for the vast majority of options that they were considering, this direct scenario where they would bypass a bunch of stock keeping points in the network would be the preferred one. So what you see here on the right-hand side is a score that we assigned to these different scenarios according to the weights that you basically provide to the different KPIs. And so you see here in green is the preferred one, so the one with the highest score. And so you see that unless I put all my emphasis on cost and unless I put all my emphasis on service level, for the vast majority of other options, I should go with my direct scenario. And this really allowed them to focus the conversation in a right way, because we are no longer actually, having a discussion on should my lead time be 20 or 25%, or should my inventory be 30 or 35%. All I need to make sure is that all of the decision makers around the table agree on the fact that we are within this single range of this range of criteria that we have described. And so this is where this interactive visual analytics can be really helpful and can actually help organizations reach these decisions much quicker than they would if they didn't have access to these tools. So these are some of the key points from today. So we talked a lot about decision support tools and the need to align them with the environment and the importance of supply chain design. There's really a lot of advances out there in optimization, simulation, etc., that we can use to expand on these tools. But the most important element to remember is that these tools and the quantitative models are decision support tools and not decision-making tools. That the ultimate decisions at a strategic level, such as supply chain design, are going to be made by human decision makers in the organizations. And there, a number of things can really facilitate that process. Cross-functional collaboration to really make sure that we are framing our problem in a way that represents our objectives. Visual analytics to create a common understanding, to create intuition around what is our model suggesting. Human-in-the-loop analytics to really make better decisions by combining the knowledge of human decision makers and the models. And then this idea of a continuous supply chain design process to increase adaptability and enable organizational learning. So that's all from my side on this presentation. Thank you so much for the time, and I'll turn it over to Bob. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Milena. And I want to thank everyone for attending. There was a lot here, so I want to remind you, you can download the presentation. We're going to load that 2020 article that was in Milena's first slide. That'll be in the resource box also. And also would like to encourage everyone, go back early on in those slides. There was a URL to go to the MIT website where you can download the white paper, which I believe is going to cover a lot of this material, because there was a lot there to take in. Really great presentation. So we are going to do a brief Q&A, just 3 to 5 questions. If you haven't done so already, please submit your questions. And again, if we don't get to all of them, we will forward them, and Milena can respond back to you by email. Milena, I want to start with just a foundational question, which is, and I never asked this back when we did it in 2020 or when you did the article, but academic research is always prompted by something. Sometimes, a company comes to you and says, we would like to fund the research. I just wondered at MIT, what was the catalyst behind this? What got you and your team interested in network design?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we at CTL, at the Center for Transportation and Logistics, we work with a very large number of companies. So I believe that right now we have 50 organizations that we are actively collaborating with, and that can be through research projects, or we organize roundtables where companies can exchange on their experience and their needs. And really what's triggered this is that we saw there was a clear disconnect between the problems that the companies were facing and the needs that they had in terms of supply chain design and what was available out there in terms of models and tools. And we saw that the supply chain design was really becoming a major driver of competitive advantage, a major driver of value, and that the models and tools were simply not aligned with that. And so we really wanted to fill that gap by addressing this new value-driven supply chain design approach.
Great. I want to ask you a couple of questions in a row that I think are kind of interrelated. So first, if you go back even before, a lot of people think that everything's been driven by COVID, right? But I started hearing in terms of, network design back around 2016, in part, particularly from manufacturers, in part because of the tariffs wars, right? They were now thinking about, this is really impacting, it might have been a cost thing, but impacting about how we're going to do business. And, one of the things we talked about are factors beyond lead times and warehousing costs or transportation costs coming into play. What initially, and I'm going to bring you up to speed, but initially, what were some of the factors beyond those traditional, lead time, warehousing costs kind of things that you saw coming into play when you were starting this research?
Yeah, so we definitely saw a few trends, really. The first one was really on the consumer side. And I think, the e-commerce, omni-channel operations, the fact that you can use your supply chain design to diversify the way that you will reach your customers and capture demand, the whole Amazon effect, that was really one very clear trend that we saw and that was not captured with the existing models. The second trend that we saw was concerns around these global operations. And as you say, I think COVID really shed light on some problems, but we didn't have to wait until COVID to see that there were some tensions there, because ultimately companies are in a situation where on the one hand you have requirements of the customers that push you towards same day delivery or next day delivery, and on the other hand you have your global supply chain that spans along multiple continents with lead times that can be of a few months. And so there's really kind of a disconnect there and a tension there that was happening. And so the idea of how do I balance between the efficiency and the need to cater to my customers, that's something that really came up. And then I think the COVID really augmented the focus on risk and resilience. So risk and resilience were always part of the discussion, but I think this made it very real for a lot of people. And when thinking about the investments that you will make in resilience, all of a sudden the ROI became much more easier to illustrate, because we had such an unprecedented move happening.
Great. So this is, I think, another, in my mind, it's a related question. One of the things that you talked about was, reshoring, and how, we get kind of mixed messages about reshoring. And I'm going to use one of your colleagues, Jim Rice. I mean, going back to like 2014 or 2015, Jim and I had a conversation about, well, was reshoring really happening? And the thing that he was, his theory was, it wasn't so much bringing back, to the U.S. Because we didn't want to do business wherever else we were doing it, but rather this idea of, platforms where you would try and, I've heard some manufacturers call it make where you sell, buy where you make, right? So they're going to try and concentrate capacity in, let's say, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. to serve North America, maybe Eastern Europe to serve Western Europe, places in Asia to serve Asia and India. And I wondered, when you look at, so that's going to call for a redesign, right? So when you look at this idea of onshoring, reshoring, do you see, reshoring, or do you see this idea of make where you sell and then source or buy where you make as kind of a driving strategy around network design?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a clear answer, but my answer is going to be something like it depends.
Okay, that's good enough.
We really see that the companies are going to have different benefits and costs of one or the other strategy, depending on the value of the product, depending on the inventory, depending on the demand variability, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really hard, I think, today to formulate like one winning recipe for your supply chain design, because you really need to kind of map all of your potential costs, all of your benefits, and really analyze the decisions from all of those ways. And we work with a very large number of companies, and we do this type of analysis for them. And there's never two designs that are going to be following the same prescribed method. And that actually brings me to another point, which is if you are saying that your supply chain design is not just there as a cost object, but is actually a driver of your competitive advantage, that means that you cannot have a generic approach to supply chain design. You can't model in the same way a company that produces iPhones or a company that produces some low value good. And so that's why saying I'm going to have just one model that I'm going to apply to everyone and it will give me the best outcome. That's just simply not possible anymore. We really need to kind of dig deeper into what are the key drivers of value of risk for your organization and reflect those into the tools that you're using.
So I've got about 27 more questions I want to ask you, but I'm looking at the clock. So you only have to worry about one more. It was either your second or third slide where you had a whole bunch of bubbles there of things. And one of them, terms drivers of network design, right? One of them was sustainability. And, this really has been a post-COVID conversation where sustainability just comes up in every conversation I have with senior level, VP level supply chain executives. So I'm just wondering, in terms of those factors other than like lead time and cost, as you're talking to folks who are aligned with MIT, is sustainability at this point factoring into their network design decisions? How's that working?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I see the same trend. Sustainability is definitely becoming more and more important, and any company making a network design decision today just cannot simply ignore the sustainability aspect. I think that a lot of the focus was on environmental sustainability for a long time, but the social sustainability questions are also becoming much more relevant, and we definitely see that. That's actually a kind of a tricky thing to sometimes incorporate into your decisions, because when you talk about environmental sustainability, a lot of people will say, well, okay, 1 ton of CO2 is going to be equal to X amount of external costs, and so I can sort of look at that on the same scale as my supply chain design cost, my operational cost. But when you talk about social sustainability, that's actually harder sometimes to quantify, like what that actually means and how that should be considered. And there, this kind of multi-criteria approach that I illustrated with this last case study, where you are explicitly saying, okay, how am I valuing different pillars of sustainability, so social, economical, and environmental, and what are the weights, and really see those trade-offs very clearly. I think that's probably the preferred way of approaching the question today. So yeah, thank you for that question.
And by the way, I think that's a really interesting take, and is consistent with conversations I'm having, because if it's something around what we would think of as network design or manufacturing processes or transportation or warehousing, that tends to focus on the CO2, right? Tends to focus on the environment. And then the broader ESG around talent and diversity, inclusion, those things tend to be an HR kind of discussion, not so much a network design kind of discussion. Great.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Milena Janjevic and MIT's Megacities Lab for a great conversation. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, Ames, Avetta, Coupa, Pivottree, and Sifted for making this webinar possible. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for attending. For Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media, I'm Bob Trebilcock.